The book of Asher, we're continuing on starting with chapter 76 to 80. Chapter 76 goes over Moses leaves Cush and goes to the land of Midian, and Ruel take him for a refugee, keep him in prison for 10 years, and is fed by Zipporah, the daughter of Ruel, Pharaoh smitten of the plagues, and slays a child of the Israelites every day. Chapter 77 goes over Adikam, Pharaoh afflicts Israel more than ever. Moses is released by Ruel and marries his daughter Zipporah. Chapter 78 goes over Moses has two sons. Pharaoh withdraws or withholds straw from the Israelites. Chapter 79 goes over mighty God Ahiah appears to Moses and commands him to go down to Egypt to deliver Israel. And chapter 80 goes over after 2 years Moses and Aaron again go to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh will not hearken. Ahiah afflicts Egypt with all manner of plagues and afflictions. So let's get started. Chapter 76. And Moses the son of Amram was still king in the land of Cush in those days, and he prospered in his kingdom, and he conducted the government of the children of Cush in justice and righteousness and integrity. And all the children of Cush loved Moses all the days that he reigned over them, and all the inhabitants of the land of Cush were greatly afraid of him. And in the 40th year of the reign of Moses over Cush, Moses was sitting on the royal throne, whilst Adoniah the queen was before him, and all the nobles were sitting around him. And Adoniah the queen said before the king and the princes, What is this thing which you, the children of Cush, have done for this long time? Surely you know that for 40 years that this man has reigned over Cush, he has not approached me, nor has he served the gods of the children of Cush. Now therefore hear, O you children of Cush, and let this man no more reign over you, as he is not of our flesh. Behold, Menacros, my son, is grown up. Let him reign over you, for it is better for you to serve the son of your Lord than to serve a stranger slave of the king of Egypt. And all the people and the nobles of the children of Cush heard the whole words of Adoniah, and the queen had spoken in their ears. And all the people were preparing until the evening, and in the morning they rose up early and made Menacru, son of Kikianus, king over them. And all the children of Cush were afraid to stretch forth their hand against Moses, for mighty God Ahiah was with Moses, and the children of Cush remembered the oath which they swore unto Moses. Therefore they did not do no harm to him. But the children of Cush gave many presents to Moses, and sent him from them with great honor. So Moses went forth from the land of Cush, and went home, and ceased to reign over Cush. And Moses was 66 years old when he went out of the land of Cush, for the thing was from mighty God Ahiah, for the period had arrived which he had appointed in the days of old, to bring forth Israel from the affliction of the children of Ham. So Moses went to Midian, for he was afraid to return to Egypt on account of Pharaoh, and he went and sat at a well of water in Midian. And the 7 daughters of Ruel the Midianite went out to feed their father's flock, and they came to the well and drew water to water their father's flock. So the shepherds of Midian came and drove them away, and Moses rose up and helped them and watered the flock. And they came home to their father Ruel and told him what Moses did for them. And they said, An Egyptian man had delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. He drew up water for us and watered the flock. And Ruel said to his daughter, And where is he? Wherefore have you left the man? And Ruel sent for him and fetched him and brought him home, and he ate bread with him. And Moses related to Ruel that he had fled from Egypt, and that he reigned 40 years over Cush, and that they afterward had taken the government from him, and had sent him away in peace with honor and with presents. And when Ruel had heard the words of Moses, Ruel said within himself, I will put this man into the prison house, whereby I shall conciliate the children of Cush, for he had fled from them. And they took and put him into the prison house, and Moses was in prison 10 years. And whilst Moses was in the prison house, Zipporah, the daughter of Ruel, took pity over him, and supported him with bread and water all the time. And all the children of Israel were yet in the land of Egypt, serving the Egyptians in all manner of hard work, and the hand of Egypt continued in severity over the children of Israel in those days. At that time, mighty God Ahijah smote Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he afflicted with the plague of leprosy from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Owing to the cruel treatment of the children of Israel was this plague at that time from mighty God Ahijah upon Pharaoh, king of Egypt. For mighty God Ahijah had hearkened to the prayer of his people, the children of Israel, and their cry reached him on account of their hard work. Still, his anger did not turn from them, and the hand of Pharaoh was still stretched out against the children of Israel. And Pharaoh hardened his neck before mighty God Ahijah, and he increased his yoke over the children of Israel, and embittered their lives with all manner of hard work. And when mighty God Ahijah had inflicted the plague upon Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he asked his wise men and sorcerers to cure him. And his wise men and sorcerers said unto him, that if the blood of little children were put into the wounds, he would be healed. And Pharaoh hearkened to them, and sent his ministers to Goshen to the children of Israel to take their little children. And Pharaoh's ministers went and took the infants of the children of Israel from the bosom of their mothers by force, and they brought them to Pharaoh daily, a child each day, and the physicians killed them and applied them to the plague. Thus did they all the days. And the number of the children which Pharaoh slew was 375. But mighty God Ahijah hearkened not to the physicians of the king of Egypt, and the plague went on increasingly mightily. And Pharaoh was 10 years afflicted with that plague. Still the heart of Pharaoh was more hardened against the children of Israel. And at the end of 10 years, mighty God Ahijah continued to afflict Pharaoh with destructive plagues. And mighty God Ahijah smote him with a bad tumor and sickness at the stomach, and that plague turned to a severe boil. And at that time the 2 ministers of Pharaoh came from the land of Goshen, where all the children of Israel were, and went to the house of Pharaoh, and said to him, we have seen the children of Israel slacken in their work and negligent in their labor. And when Pharaoh heard the words of his ministers, his anger was kindled against the children of Israel exceedingly, for he was greatly grieved at his bodily pain. And he answered and said, now that the children of Israel know that I am ill, they turn and scoff at us. Now therefore harden my chariot for me, and I will betake myself to Goshen, and will see the scoff of the children of Israel, with which they are deriding me. So his servants harnessed the chariot for him. And they took and made him ride upon a horse, for he was not able to ride of himself. And he took with him 10 horsemen and 10 footmen, and went to the children of Israel to Goshen. And when they had come to the border of Egypt, the king's horse passed into a narrow place, elevated in the hollow part of the vineyard, fenced on both sides, the low plain country being on the other side. And the horse ran rapidly in that place, and pressed each other, and the other horses pressed the king's horse. And the king's horse fell into the low plain, whilst the king was riding upon it. And when he fell, the chariot turned over the king's face, and the horse lay upon the king. And the king cried out, for his flesh was very sore. And the flesh of the king was torn from him, and his bones were broken, and he could not ride. For this thing was from mighty God Ahijah to him. For mighty God Ahijah had heard the cries of his people, the children of Israel, in their affliction. And his servants carried him upon their shoulders, and little at a time, and they brought him back to Egypt. And the horsemen who were with him came also back to Egypt. And they placed him in his bed, and the king knew that his end was come to die. So Apparaniat, the queen, his wife, came and cried before the king, and the king wept a great weeping with her. And all the nobles and servants came on that day, and saw the king in that affliction, and wept a great weeping with him. And the prince of the king and all his counselors advised the king to cause one to reign in his stead in the land, whomsoever he should choose from his sons. And the king had 3 sons and 2 daughters, which Apparented the queen his wife had borne to him, besides the king's children of concubines. And these were the names of the firstborn: Othri, the second Adakim, and the third Morion, and their sisters. The name of the elder Bethia, and of the other Acusi. And Othri, the firstborn of the king, was an idiot, precipitate, and hurried in his words. But Adikam was a cunning and wise man, and knowing in all the wisdom of Egypt, but unseemly aspect, thick in flesh, and very short in stature. His weight was 1 cubit. And when the king saw Adikam his son intelligent and wise in all things, the king resolved that he should be king in his stead after his death. And he took for him a wife, Gedudah, daughter of Abilat, and he was 10 years old, and she bare unto him 4 sons. And he afterward went and took 3 wives, and begat 8 sons and 3 daughters. And the disorder greatly prevailed over the king, and his flesh stank like the flesh of a carcass cast upon the field in summer time during the heat of the sun. And when the king saw that his sickness had greatly strengthened itself over him, he ordered his son Adikam to be brought to him, and that made him king over the land in his place. And at the end of 3 years, the king died in shame, disgrace, and disgust, and his servants carried him and buried him in the sepulchre of the king of Egypt in Zoan Mizraim. But they embalmed him not as was usual with kings, for his flesh was putrid, and they could not approach to embalm him on account of the stench, so they buried him in haste. For this evil was from mighty God Ahiah to him, for mighty God Ahiah had requited him evil for the evil which in his days he had done to Israel. And he died with terror and with shame, and his son Adikam reigned in his place. Chapter 77. Adikam was 20 years old when he reigned over Egypt. He reigned 4 years. In the 206th year of Israel going down to Egypt did Adikam reign over Egypt, but he continued not so long in his reign over Egypt as his father had continued their reigns. For Milo, his father, reigned 94 years in Egypt, but he was 10 years sick and died, for he had been wicked before mighty God Ahiah. And all the Egyptians called the name of Adikam Pharaoh, like the name of his fathers, as was their custom to do in Egypt. And all the wise men of Pharaoh called the name of Adikam Ahaz, for short is called Ahaz in the Egyptian language. And Adikam was exceedingly ugly, and he was a cubit and a span, and he had a great beard, which reached to the soles of his feet. And Pharaoh sat upon his father's throne to reign over Egypt, and he conducted the government of Egypt in his wisdom. And whilst he reigned, he exceeded his father and all the preceding kings in wickedness, and he increased his yoke over the children of Israel. And he went with his servants to Goshen to the children of Israel, and he strengthened the labor over them, and he said unto them, complete your work each day's task, and let not your hands slacken from our work from this day forward, as you did in the days of my father. And he placed officers over them from amongst the children of Israel, and over these officers he placed taskmasters from amongst his servants. And he placed over them a measure of bricks for them to do according to that number day by day, and he turned back and went to Egypt. At that time the taskmasters of Pharaoh ordered the officers of the children of Israel according to the command of Pharaoh, saying, thus says Pharaoh, do your work each day, and finish your task, and observe the daily measure of brick, diminish not anything. And it shall come to pass that if you are deficient in your daily brick, I will put your young children in their stead. And the taskmasters of Egypt did so in those days as Pharaoh had ordered them. And whenever any deficiency was found in the children of Israel's measure of their daily brick, the taskmasters of Pharaoh would go to the wives of the children of Israel and take infants of the children of Israel to number of bricks deficient they would take them by force from their mother's lap and put them in the building instead of the bricks, whilst their father and mothers were crying over them and weeping when they heard the weeping voices of their infants in the wall of the buildings. The taskmasters prevailed over Israel, that the Israelites should place their children in the building, so that a man place his son in the wall and put mortar over him, whilst his eyes wept over him, and his tears ran down upon his child. And the taskmasters of Egypt did so to the babes of Israel for many days, and no one pitied or had compassion over the babes of the children of Israel. And the number of all the children killed in the building were 270, some whom they had built upon instead of the brick, which had been left deficient by their fathers, and some whom they had drawn out dead from the building. And the labor imposed upon the children of Israel in the days of Anakim exceeded in hardship that which they performed in the days of his father. And the children of Israel sighed every day on account of their heavy work, for they had said to themselves, Behold, when Pharaoh shall die, his son will rise up and lighten our work. But they increased the latter work more than the former, and the children of Israel sighed at this, and they cried, Ascended to mighty God Ahiah on account of this labor. And mighty God Ahiah heard the voice of the children of Israel and their cry in those days. And mighty God Ahiah remembered them his covenant which he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And mighty God Ahiah saw the burden of the children of Israel and their heavy work in those days, and he determined to deliver them. And Moses the son of Amram was still confined in the dungeon in those days in the house of Ruel the Midianite, and Zipporah the daughter of Ruel did support him with food secretly day by day. And Moses was confined in the dungeon in the house of Ruel for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, which was the first year of the reign of Pharaoh over Egypt in the place of his father, Zipporah said to her father Ruel, No person inquires or seeks after the Hebrew man whom thou didst bind in prison now 10 years. Now therefore, if it seem good in thy sight, let us send and see whether he is living or dead. But her father knew not that she had supported him. And Ruel her father answered and said to her, Has ever such a thing happened, that a man should be shut up in a prison without food for 10 years, and that he should live? And Zipporah answered her father, saying, Surely thou hast heard that the God of the Hebrews is great and awful, and does wonders for them at all times. He it was who delivered Abraham from Ur of the Chaldeans, and Isaac from the sword of his father, and Jacob from the angel of mighty God Ahiah, who wrestled with him at the ford of Jabbok. Also with this man has he done many things. He delivered him from the river in Egypt, and from the sword of Pharaoh, and from the children of Cush. So also can he deliver him from famine, and make him live. And the thing seemed good in the sight of Ruel, and he did according to the word of his daughter, and sent to the dungeon to ascertain what became of Moses. And he saw, and behold, the man Moses was living in the dungeon, standing upon his feet, praising and praying to mighty God Ahiah of his ancestors. And Ruel commanded Moses to be brought out of the dungeon, so that shaved him, and he changed his prison garments and ate bread. And afterward Moses went into the garden of Ruel, which was behind the house, and he there prayed to mighty God Ahiah, his mighty God El Elohi, who had done mighty wonders for him. And it was that whilst he prayed, he looked opposite to him, and behold, a sapphire stick was placed in the ground, which was planted in the midst of the garden. And he approached the stick, and he looked, and behold, the name of mighty God Ahiah of hosts was engraved thereon, written and developed upon the stick. And he read it, and stretched forth his hand, and he plucked it like a forest tree from the thicket, and the stick was in his hand. And this is the stick with which all the work of our mighty God Ahiah, our El Elohi, were performed, after he had created heaven and earth, and all the host of them, seas, rivers, and all their fishes. And when mighty God Ahiah had driven Adam from the Garden of Eden, he took the stick in his hand, and went and tilled the ground from which he was taken. And the stick came down to Noah and was given to Shem and his descendants until it came into the hand of Abraham the Hebrew. And when Abraham had given all he had to his son Isaac, he also gave to him the stick. And when Jacob had fled to Paddan Aram, he took it into his hand, and when he returned to his father, he had not left it behind him. Also when he went down to Egypt, he took it into his hand and gave it to Joseph, one portion above his brethren, for Jacob had taken it by force from his brother Esau. And after the death of Joseph, the nobles of Egypt came into the house of Joseph, and the stick came into the hand of Reuel the Midianite. And when he went out of Egypt, he took it in his hand and planted it in his garden. And all the mighty men of the Kenites tried to pluck it when they endeavored to get Zipporah his daughter, but they were unsuccessful. So that stick remained planted in the garden of Reuel until he came who had a right to it and took it. And when Reuel saw the stick in the hand of Moses, he wondered at it, and he gave him his daughter Zipporah for a wife. Chapter 78. At that time died Baal Canaan, son of Achbor, king of Edom, and was buried in his house in the land of Edom. And after his death the children of Esau sent to the land of Edom, and took from there a man who was in Edom, whose name was Hadad, and they made him king over them in the place of Baal Canaan, their king. And Hadad reigned over the children of Edom 48 years. And when he reigned, he resolved to fight against the children of Moab, to bring them under the power of the children of Esau, as they were before. But he was not able, because the children of Moab heard this thing, and they rose up and hastened to elect a king over them from amongst their brethren. And they afterward gathered together a great people, and sent to the children of Ammon their brethren for help to fight against Hadad king of Edom. And Hadad heard the thing which the children of Moab had done, and was greatly afraid of them, and refrained from fighting against them. In those days Moses the son of Amram in Midian took Zipporah the daughter of Reuel the Midianite for a wife. And Zipporah walked in the ways of the daughter of Jacob. She was nothing short of the righteousness of Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. And Zipporah conceived and bare a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I was a stranger in a foreign land. But he circumcised not his foreskin at the command of Reuel his father-in-law. And she conceived again and bare a son, but circumcised his foreskin, and called his name Eleazar. For Moses said, because mighty God Ahijah of my fathers was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh king of Egypt great increased the labor of the children of Israel in those days, and continued to make his yoke heavier upon the children of Israel. And he ordered a proclamation to be made in Egypt, saying, give no more straw to the people to make brick with. Let them go and gather themselves straw as they can find it. Also the tale of bricks which they shall make, let them give each day, and diminish nothing from them, for they are idle in their work. And the children of Israel heard this, and they mourned and sighed, and they cried unto mighty God Ahijah on account of the bitterness of their soul. And mighty God Ahijah heard the cries of the children of Israel, and saw the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. And mighty God Ahijah was jealous of his people and his inheritance, and heard their voice, and he resolved to take them out of the affliction of Egypt, to give them the land of Canaan for a possession. Chapter 79. And in those days Moses was feeding the flock of Reuel the Midianite, his father-in-law, beyond the wilderness of Sin, and the stick which he took from his father-in-law was in his hand. And it came to pass one day that a kid of goats strayed from the flock, and Moses pursued it, and it came to the mountain of mighty God Ahijah, to Horeb. And when he came to Horeb, mighty God Ahijah appeared there unto him in the bush, and he found the bush burning with fire, but the fire had no power over the bush to consume it. And Moses was greatly astonished at this sight, wherefore the bush was not consumed. And he approached to see the mighty thing. And mighty God Ahijah called unto Moses out of the fire, and commanded him to go down to Egypt, to Pharaoh king of Egypt, to send the children of Israel from his service. And mighty God Ahiah said unto Moses, Go, return to Egypt, for all those men who sought thy life are dead, and thou shalt speak unto Pharaoh to send forth the children of Israel from his land. And mighty God Ahiah showed him to do signs and wonders in Egypt before the eyes of Pharaoh and the eyes of his subjects, in order that they might believe that mighty God Ahiah had sent him. And Moses hearkened to all that mighty God Ahiah had commanded him, and he returned to his father-in-law and told him the thing. And Ruel said to go in peace. Said to him, Go in peace. And Moses rose up to go to Egypt, and he took his wife and sons with him, and he was at an inn in the road, and an angel of mighty God Ahiah came down and sought an occasion against him. And he wished to kill him on account of his firstborn son, because he had not circumcised him, and had transgressed the covenant which mighty God Ahiah had made with Abraham. For Moses had hearkened to the words of his father-in-law, which he had spoken to him not to circumcise his firstborn son. Therefore he circumcised him not. And Zipporah saw the angel of mighty God Ahiah seeking an occasion against Moses, and she knew that this thing was owing to his not having circumcised her son Gershom. And Zipporah hastened and took of the sharp rock stones and were there, and she circumcised her son, and delivered her husband and her son from the hand of the angel of mighty God Ahiah. And Aaron the son of Amram, the brother of Moses, was in Egypt walking at the river side on that day. And mighty God Ahiah appeared to him in that place, and he said to him, Go now toward Moses in the wilderness. And he went and met him in the mountain of mighty God Ahiah, and he kissed him. And Aaron lifted up his eyes and saw Zipporah his wife, and Moses and her children. And he said unto Moses, Who are these unto thee? And Moses said unto him, They are my wife and sons, which mighty God Ahiah gave to me in Midian. And the thing grieved Aaron on account of the woman and her children. And Aaron said to Moses, Send away the woman and her children, that they may go to her father's house. And Moses hearkened to the words of Aaron, and did so. And Zipporah returned with her children, and they went to the house of Ruel, and remained there until the time arrived when mighty God Ahiah had visited his people, and brought them forth from Egypt from the hand of Pharaoh. And Moses and Aaron came to Egypt, to the community of the children of Israel, and they spoke to them all the words of mighty God Ahiah, and the people rejoiced in exceeding great rejoicing. And Moses and Aaron rose up early on the next day, and they went to the house of Pharaoh, and they took in their hand the stick of mighty God Ahiah. And when they came to the king's gate, 2 young lions were confined there with iron instruments, and no persons went out or came in from before them, unless those whom the king ordered to come. When the conjurers came and withdrew the lions by their incantations, and this brought them to the king. And Moses hastened and lifted up the stick upon the lions, and he loosened them. And Moses and Aaron came into the king's house. The lions also came with them in joy, and they followed them, and rejoiced as a dog rejoices over his master when he comes from the field. And when Pharaoh saw this thing, he was astonished at it, and he was greatly terrified at the report, for their appearances was like the appearances of the children of God. And Pharaoh said to Moses, What do you require? And they answered him, saying, The mighty God Ahiah, our El Elohi of the Hebrews, has sent us to thee, to say, Send forth my people, that they may serve me. And when Pharaoh heard their words, he was greatly terrified before them. And he said to them, Go today and come back tomorrow. And they did according to the word of the king. And when they had gone, Pharaoh sent for Balaam the magician, and Jannes and Jambres his sons, and to all the magicians and conjurers and counselors which belonged to the king, and they all came and sat before the king. And the king told them all the words which Moses and his brother Aaron had spoken to him. And the magician said to the king, But how can the men to thee on account of the lions which were confined at the gate? And the king said, Because they lifted up their rod against the lions, and loosed them, and came to me. And the lions also rejoiced at them, as a dog rejoiced to meet his master. And Balaam the son of Beor the magician answered the king, saying, These are none else than magicians like ourselves. Now therefore send for them, and let them come, and we will try them. And the king did so. And in the morning Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron to come before the king, and they took the rod of mighty God Ahiah, and came to the king, and spoke to him, saying, Thus says mighty God Ahiah, El Elohi, mighty God of the Hebrews, send my people that they may serve me. And the king said to them, But who will believe you that you are the messengers of mighty God Ahiah, and that you come to me by his order? Now therefore give a wonder or sign in this matter, and then the words which you speak will be believed. And Aaron hastened and threw the rod out of his hand before Pharaoh and before his servants, and the rod turned into a serpent. And the sorcerers saw this, and they cast each man his rod upon the ground, and they became serpents. And the serpent of Aaron's rod lifted up its head, and opened its mouth to swallow the rods of the magicians. And Balaam the magician answered and said, This thing has been for the days of old, that a serpent should swallow its fellow, and that living thing devour each other. Now therefore restore it to a rod as it was at first, and we will also restore our rods as they were at first. And if the rod shall swallow our rods, then shall we know that the spirit of mighty God Ahiah is in thee, and if not, thou art only an artificer like unto ourselves. And Aaron hastened and stretched forth his hand, and caught hold of the serpent's tail, and it became a rod in his hand. And the sorcerers did the like with the rods, and they got hold, each man of the tail of their serpents, and they became rods at first. And when they were restored to rods, the rod of Aaron swallowed up their rods. And when the king saw this thing, he ordered the book of records that related to the king of Egypt to be brought, and they brought the book of records, the chronicles of the king of Egypt, in which all the idols of Egypt were inscribed, for they thought of finding therein the name of mighty God Ahiah, but they found it not. And Pharaoh saw to Moses and Aaron, Behold, I have not found the name of your mighty God Ahiah written in this book, and his name I know not. And the counselors and wise men answered the king, We have heard that the El Elohi, the mighty God of the Hebrews, is a son of the wise, the son of ancient kings. And Pharaoh turned to Moses and Aaron and said to them, I know not mighty God Ahiah whom you have declared, neither will I send his people. And they answered and said to the king, Mighty God Ahiah, El Elohi, the mighty God, the God of gods is his name, and he proclaimed his name over us from the days of our ancestors, and sent us, saying, Go to Pharaoh and say unto him, Send my people that they may serve me. Now therefore send us, that we may take a journey for 3 days in the wilderness, and there may sacrifice to him, for from the days of our going down to Egypt he has not taken from our hands either burnt offerings, oblations, or sacrifice. And if thou wilt not send us, his anger will be kindled against thee, and he will smite Egypt either with the plague or with the sword. And Pharaoh said to them, Tell me now his power and his might. And they said to him, He created the heaven and the earth, the seas and all the fishes, and he formed the light, created the darkness. He caused rain upon the earth and watered it. He made the herbage and the grass to sprout. He created man and beast and the animals of the forest, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and by his mouth they live and die. Surely he created thee in thy mother's womb, and he put into thee the breath of life, and reared thee, and placed thee upon the royal throne of Egypt. And he will take thy breath and soul from thee, and return thee to the ground whence thou wast taken. And the anger of the king was kindled at their words, and he said to them, But who amongst all the gods of nations can do this? My river is mine own, and I have made it myself. And he drove them from him, and he ordered the labor upon Israel to be more severe than it was yesterday and before. And Moses and Aaron went out from the king's presence, and they saw the children of Israel in an evil condition, for the taskmasters had made their labor exceedingly heavy. And Moses returned to mighty God Ahiah and said, Why hast thou ill-treated thy people? For since I came to speak to Pharaoh, wilt thou didst send me? For he has exceedingly ill us, the children of Israel. And mighty God Ahiah said to Moses, Behold, thou wilt see that with an outstretched hand and heavy plagues Pharaoh will send the children of Israel from his hand. And Moses and Aaron dwelt amongst the brethren, the children of Israel, in Egypt. And as for the children of Israel, the Egyptians embittered their lives with heavy work which they imposed upon them. Chapter 80, the last chapter for today. And at the end of 2 years, mighty God Ahiah again sent Moses to Pharaoh to bring forth the children of Israel and to send them out of the land of Egypt. And Moses went and came to the house of Pharaoh, and he spoke to him the words of mighty God Ahiah, who had sent him. But Pharaoh would not hearken to the voice of mighty God Ahiah, and mighty God Ahiah, our El Elohi, roused his might in Egypt upon Pharaoh and his subjects, and mighty God Ahiah smote Pharaoh and his people with very great and sore plagues. And mighty God Ahiah sent by the hand of Aaron, and turned all the waters of Egypt into blood with all their streams and rivers. And when an Egyptian came to drink and drew water, he looked into his pitcher, and behold, all the water was turned into blood. And when he came to drink from his cup, the water in the cup became blood. And when a woman kneaded her dough and cooked her victuals, their appearance was turned into that of blood. And mighty God Ahiah sent again, and caused all their water to bring forth frogs, and all the frogs came into the houses of the Egyptians. And when the Egyptians drank, their bellies were filled with frogs, and they danced in their bellies, and they danced when in the river. And all their drinking water and cooking water turned to frogs. Also when they lay in their beds, their perspiration bred frogs. Notwithstanding all this, the anger of mighty God Ahiah did not turn from them, and his hand was stretched out against all the Egyptians, to smite them with every heavy plague. And he sent and smote their dust to lice, and the lice became in Egypt to the height of 2 cubits upon the earth. The lice were also very numerous in the flesh of man and beast, and all the inhabitants of Egypt. Also upon the king and queen mighty God Ahiah sent the lice, and it grieved Egypt exceedingly on account of the lice. Notwithstanding this, the anger of mighty God Ahiah did not turn away, and his hand was still stretched out over Egypt. And mighty God Ahiah sent all kind of beasts of the field into Egypt, and they came and destroyed all Egypt, man and beast and trees and all things that were in Egypt. And mighty God Ahiah sent furious serpents, scorpions, mice, weasels, toads, together with other creeping in dust, flies, hornets, fleas, bugs, and gnats, each swarms according to its kind. And all reptiles and winged animals according to their kind came to Egypt, and grieved the Egyptians exceedingly. And the fleas and flies came into the eyes and ears of the Egyptians. And the hornets came upon them and drove them away, and they removed from it into the inner rooms, and it pursued them. And when the Egyptians hid themselves on account of the swarm of animals, they locked their doors after them, and mighty God Ahiah ordered the Selenut, which was in the sea, to come up and go into Egypt. And she had long arms 10 cubits in length of the cubit of a man. And she went upon the roofs, and uncovered the raftering and flooring, and cut them, and stretched forth her arm into the house, and removed the lock and the bolt, and opened the houses of Egypt. Afterward came the swarm of animals into the house of Egypt, and the swarm of animals destroyed the Egyptians, and it grieved them exceedingly. Notwithstanding this, the anger of mighty God Ahiah did not turn away from the Egyptians, and his hand was yet stretched forth against them. And mighty God Ahiah sent the pestilence, and the pestilence pervaded Egypt in the horses and asses, and in the camels and herds of oxen and sheep, and in man. And when the Egyptians rose up early in the morning to take their cattle to pasture, they found all their cattle dead. And there remained of the cattle of the Egyptians only 1 in 10, and of the cattle belonging to Israel in Goshen not one died. And mighty God Ahiah sent a burning inflammation of the flesh of the Egyptians, which burst their skin, and it became a severe itch in all the Egyptians, from the soles of their feet to the crowns of their head. And many balls were in their flesh, that their flesh wasted away until they became rotten and putrid. Notwithstanding this, the anger of mighty God Ahiah did not turn away, and his hand was still stretched out over all Egypt. And mighty God Ahiah sent a very heavy hail, which smote their vines, and broke their fruit trees, and dried them up that they fell upon them. Also every green herb became dry and perished, for a mingling fire descended amidst the hail. Therefore the hail and the fire consumed all things. Also men and beasts that were found abroad perished of the flames of fire, and of the hail, and all the young lions were exhausted. And mighty God Ahijah sent and brought numerous locusts into Egypt, the Chasul, Salam, Chargo, and the Chago, locusts each of its kind, which devoured all that the hail had left remaining. Then the Egyptians rejoiced at the locusts, although they consumed the produce of the field, that they caught them in abundance and salted them for food. And mighty God Ahijah turned a mighty wind of the sea, which took away all the locusts, even those that were salted, and thrust them into the Red Sea. Not one locust remained within the boundaries of Egypt. And mighty God Ahijah sent darkness upon Egypt, that the whole land of Egypt and Pathros became dark for 3 days, so that a man could not see his hand when he lifted it to his mouth. At that time died many of the people of Israel who had rebelled against mighty God Ahijah, and who would not hearken to Moses and Aaron, and believed not in them that mighty God Ahijah had sent them, and who had said, We will not go forth from Egypt, lest we perish with hunger in a desolate wilderness, and who would not hearken to the voice of Moses. And mighty God Ahijah plagued them in the 3 days of darkness, and the Israelites buried them in those days, without the Egyptians knowing of them or rejoicing over them. And darkness was very great in Egypt for 3 days, and any person who was standing when the darkness came remained standing in his place, and he that was still remained sitting, and he that was lying continued lying in the same state, and he that was walking remained sitting upon the ground in the same spot. And this thing happened to all the Egyptians until the darkness had passed away. And the days of darkness passed away, and mighty God Ahijah sent Moses and Aaron to the children of Israel, saying, Celebrate your feast, and make your Passover. For behold, I come in the midst of the night amongst all the Egyptians, and I will smite all the firstborn, from the firstborn of man to the firstborn of beast, and I will see your Passover, and I will pass over you. And the children of Israel did according to all that mighty God Ahijah had commanded Moses, as Aaron did they in that night. And it came to pass in the middle of the night that mighty God Ahijah went forth in the midst of Egypt, and smote all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of man to the firstborn of beast. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry throughout Egypt in that night, for there was not a house in which there was not a corpse. Also the likeness of the firstborn of Egypt, which were carved in the walls at their houses, were destroyed and fell to the ground. Even the bones of the firstborn who had died before this, and whom they had buried in their houses, were raked up by the dogs of Egypt on that night, and dragged before the Egyptians, and cast before them. And all the Egyptians saw this evil which had suddenly come upon them, and all the Egyptians cried out with a loud voice. And all the families of Egypt wept upon that night, each man from his son, and each man for his daughter, being the firstborn. And the tumult of Egypt was heard at a distance on that night. And Bathia, the daughter of Pharaoh, went forth with the king on that night to seek Moses and Aaron in their houses, and they found them in their houses, eating and drinking and rejoicing with all Israel. And Bathia said to Moses, Is this the reward for the good which I have done to thee, who have reared thee and stretched thee out, and thou hast brought this evil upon me and my father's house? And Moses said to her, Surely 10 plagues did mighty God Ahijah bring upon Egypt. Did any evil accrue to thee from any of them? Did one of them affect thee? And she said, No. And Moses said to her, Although thou art the firstborn to thy mother, thou shalt not die, and no evil shall reach thee in the midst of Egypt. And she said, What advantage is it to me when I see the king, my brother, and all his household and subjects in this evil, whose firstborn perish with all the firstborn of Egypt? And Moses said to her, Surely thy brother and his household and subjects, the family of Egypt, will not hearken to the words of mighty God Ahijah. Therefore did this evil come upon them. And Pharaoh king of Egypt approached Moses and Aaron and some of the children of Israel who were with them in that place, and he prayed to them, saying, Rise up and take your brethren, all the children of Israel who are in the land, with their sheep and oxen, and all the belonging to them. They shall leave nothing remaining. Only pray for me to mighty God Ahijah, your Elohim. And Moses said to Pharaoh, Behold, though thou art thy mother firstborn, yet fear not, for thou wilt not die. For mighty God Ahijah has commanded that thou shalt live, in order to show thee his great might and strong stretched out arm. And Pharaoh ordered the children of Israel to be sent away, and all the Egyptians strengthened themselves to send them, for they said, We are all perishing. And all the Egyptians sent the Israelites forth with great riches, sheep and oxen, and precious things, according to the oath of mighty God Ahijah between him and the father Abraham. And the children of Israel delayed going forth at night, and when the Egyptians came to them to bring them out, they said to them, Are we thieves that we should go forth at night? And the children of Israel asked of the Egyptians vessels of silver and vessels of gold and garments, and the children of Israel stripped the Egyptians. And Moses hastened and rose up and went to the river of Egypt, and brought up from thence the coffin of Joseph, and took it with him. The children of Israel also brought up each man his father's coffin with him, and each man the coffin of his tribe. And we're going to stop at that. We will continue with chapter 81 tomorrow. Thank you for listening.